So you had a good Easter?
Yes. With this kind of spring, you know, there hardly has been a better spring in the last decade than this one.
No, it's great. Let's hope it continues. And you see today we found a different location. We're in a place called Bronx. It's new for me. It's not Bronx, New York, by the way. Let's make this clear for the audience. It's Bronx, Brussels. And it's a theatre and it's a cafe. First time I've been here. But I hope the audience doesn't think that this has been chosen as the theatre of the absurd, because
in light of the topic of
the topic of today often strikes people as being a somewhat sort of absurd subject that we've been living for the last sort of more than half century under the threat of sort of total nuclear devastation.
Coffee comes right away.
So I thought, Joseph, that would be obviously a good topic for our discussion today, because of course, although nuclear weapons are still very much in existence, the numbers have come down and the Cold War is over. The antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union is no more. So does this mean, I suppose this is the first question I'd like to put to you, that somehow we don't need to worry so much about nuclear weapons or proliferation in the way that we once did? That they still exist, but somehow they're less dangerous. Do you see it that way, or do you still believe that, for example, you know, when you go to bed at night and you have nightmares, that the nuclear problem would be the thing that you would worry about most?
Well, it's
thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.
Oh, cheers. You could help.
Yeah. It's still a lot of a nightmare issue, you know, though it's not the same as it used to be with the high alert situation of a bipolar order. On the other hand, that was also a fairly rational situation with a lot of brains continuously involved in understanding how the whole deterrence mechanism worked. And that we don't have anymore. Probably we don't have the same type of conflict rationality, but we still have an abundance of these weapons. We have them in the hands of people. We don't know how they tick, what their aims are, what they're up to. So, in fact, you know, the specter of, you know, Kissinger said that decades ago, of a world with 50 or more nuclear states is quite frightening.
So you see that sort of potential proliferators like Iran or North Korea or others like Syria that we know in the past have tried to develop these programs. Do you believe that they could sort of take the place of the old Soviet Union in terms of the level of danger that they could pose to Western security?
No, I don't think that way, because it's never going to be this type of conflict scenario. It's never going to be the same amount or the arsenal of nuclear weapons or the refinement in the strategy to possibly apply them. Be they for offensive or defensive use. You know? It's going to be more low scale, probably dirtier than in the past, and it will be less rational in type, in the sense of their application.
So if I understood,
it's even more worrisome.
Yeah, so in other words, if I've understood correctly, it's the idea that the numbers, of course, are far less. Iran or North Korea don't have the same numbers as the Soviet Union once did, or Russia or the United States today. But it's this sort of willingness to use the weapons, the threshold for the potential use, the rationality of the actors. But then that, of course, leads me to sort of wonder if people like the new proliferators, North Korea, Iran, are not going to be rational. Is deterrence going to work? Because, you know, what we had during the Cold War to maintain stability was this idea of mutual assured destruction. I can inflict the same damage on you as you can on me. You can't win a war. I can't win a war either. And that seemed to work to keep the peace. But do you think that that classical deterrence doesn't work vis-a-vis, for example, Iran or North Korea now?
I think it's hard to see it working in the classic way. Because for the classic deterrence scenario, you need almost a sort of strategic, an acknowledged strategic parity. And both sides need to be seen following a similar pattern of reasoning about their nuclear arsenal. And that was given with the US and the Soviet Union on the other hand. Now, with nuclear weapons in the hands of other states, of other countries, probably deterrence is still one of the most, or the strongest force driving them. After all, you know, nuclear weapons, except for the very beginning, have always been mostly a deterrent weapon. But it's not working in this kind of this mutual assured destruction environment. It simply works under the suspicion that if you own and demonstrate the possession of nuclear weapons, it will be very much more difficult for countries in your environment, near or far, to play with you, or
so
to,
in other words,
to put harm in.
they are trying to deter us, you think?
I would say,
as much as we worry about how
yeah.
we can deter them, there's this kind of reverse psychology at play.
In all of those countries where we have seen a quest to acquire nuclear weapons, they, in their own assessment, feel threatened, feel that they exist in a hostile environment, be that North Korea or be that Iran, be that Israel at that point, even though Israel is still an undeclared nuclear power. But the situation is always there. There's a strong neighborhood that this actor believes is extremely hostile, yeah. And they are looking for these kind of weapons in order to protect themselves, usually not calculating that exactly this kind of reasoning also makes the neighbors think.
Yeah. But how are we then going to break out of that sort of mutually exacerbating psychology? You know, I'm reacting to my fear of you like you are reacting to your fear of me. I mean, are we sort of in a downward spiral here, or do you see, for example, Obama's vision of a nuclear-free world, things that are happening in arms control, things that are happening between Russia and the United States with the New START treaty going down? Do you sort of see these things as positive in the sense that we're able to break out of that syndrome and reverse this kind of nuclear proliferation?
Well, on the one hand, we're going down when it comes to classic actors on the stage. With the new actors, I don't really see that happening, because we're still in kind of an upward spiral.
This is a bit of a worry, because I sort of grew up like you did in a world where we were sort of told that if the big powers sort of led by example and came down to very low levels, then other nuclear powers, for example, France or the UK or China, the official nuclear powers, would sort of be obliged to join the movement. But more importantly, you know, once the United States was down at 100 warheads, or Russia, this would apply pressure on Iran or North Korea. What you seem to be implying, this is sort of sobering, is that sort of leading by example, although it's obviously good in itself, you know, lower numbers are good, but that sort of idea doesn't work.
Well,
despite what we do, they continue to proliferate.
Yeah, we've seen that with climate change. You know, it's going ahead does not necessarily mean everybody else is ready to follow. But, you know, it means Iran is a very sensitive case. Iran is one of the non-Arab countries in a mostly Arab environment. And so will the Arab states at large be comfortable with the situation that a nuclear Iran might exist? Now, one could address that issue possibly through addressing the underlying issue. So if it is Iran that fears its neighborhood in external actors, giving them more confidence in their geopolitical situation might ease their desire for nuclear weapons. You know, this attempt has been tried, but it hasn't been the strongest sales argument so far.
Strikes me a little bit like giving into blackmail. You know, you address all of our security concerns, no matter how justified, or we're going to develop nuclear weapons. Leaves a bad taste in the mouth a little bit.
You've seen it voiced from the sides of those seeking nuclear weapons that they have made that linkage. You don't really know whether they made it for good reasons or serious reasons, or whether it is just one of those tricks in order to prolong the talking phase, giving them more time to advance on their program.
But if I wanted to play the devil's advocate, could you sort of say, well, look, nuclear deterrence worked between the Soviet Union and the United States. We had peace. Of course, it was sometimes a risky peace. With the Cuban Missile Crisis, we came close to an actual nuclear war. But by and large, you know, the periods of stability were much longer than the periods of crises. And therefore, why can't that same sort of system of nuclear deterrence work between other potentially conflicting parties? You know, India, Pakistan have got nuclear weapons. You mentioned Iran vis-a-vis its neighbours. I mean, would proliferation, at least among the major powers, we're not talking yet, Joseph, about sub-state actors like Hamas or Hezbollah, but would proliferation among the major powers be such a bad thing? In other words, you know, if you're a policymaker, do you sort of work on the basis of the inevitability of proliferation? It's going to happen, and therefore, how do we manage it? In a way that, you know, we managed the Russian or Soviet US balance of power, or do you still believe that this is the most absolute of catastrophic scenarios, and that whatever it takes, we've got to prevent countries like Iran or North Korea developing the weapon? I mean, which way do we go now then? Acceptance, or still trying to, as a former boss of mine said, put the toothpaste back into the tube?
Yeah, it's one of the hardest things to do. There are lessons in both directions. On the one hand, we can probably assume that the larger the number, the more will go wrong, the more will happen, the less likely it is that everyone will subscribe to the same kind of rationality in dealing with the existence of nuclear weapons, both on those who possess it and those who feel threatened by new nukes in their neighborhood. On the other hand, if you look at the case of India and Pakistan, obviously the fact that both sides have a destructive potential has in a way tamed their conflict. It hasn't solved it yet, but in a way it has not led to renewed major escalation of military threat or violence, if you disregard for the moment that over Kashmir they're still struggling after decades. But apart from that, it has in a way rationalized both actors. Whether this applies when proliferation continues, and with every proliferator there are more new or potential recipients. So that dynamic could be very hard to control. So I would still believe that for the major powers, for the classic nuclear powers, and for alliances such as NATO, this is an extremely important issue to control proliferation and to come up with a good and solid strategy on what do we do once and when one of these countries now in the process ends up actually owning and operating nuclear weapons.
Well, I suppose that's a good point. I mean, what can an organisation like NATO do to at least sort of halt proliferation, or at least stabilise it at existing levels, even if for the time being we can't go down very much? I suppose one answer is to try to devalue the political leverage that you can get from having a nuclear weapon. I mean, countries, as you know, you said so, acquire nuclear weapons not only to protect themselves or to deal with their perceptions of threat, but because of prestige. Yeah. We still live in a world where the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council happen to be, as you said, the classical 5 nuclear weapons states. And so there is a certain element of prestige attached to it. But if you're in a situation where the possession of a nuclear weapon doesn't sort of bring you much advantage, you may be sort of disincentivized from acquiring one. So I suppose one of the things that we're doing in NATO is to construct this missile defense system in Europe. As you know, it's decision of the Lisbon summit, it's going ahead. And the idea being that if you can have a fairly effective shield, what's the point for a country like Iran to acquire missiles and nuclear weapons if you can't direct them to the target? If they're going to be shot down, it's a wasted expenditure.
Unless they would want to use it in the neighborhood.
Yes.
Which would create some difficulties for the missile defense shield. Right?
Well, that means that you then have to start expanding it beyond your territory, don't you? And partners, and we're already having this, by the way, from certain countries in the neighborhood who say, look, can you NATO, even if we're not members, not help us with some of these issues? And I know that Hillary Clinton has suggested that a US missile shield could be expanded to friendly countries or US allies in the Gulf. So that's one answer. But do you think that, for example, a NATO missile shield in Europe means that then we don't need, for example, to have nuclear weapons any longer? We can just rely upon the defence without having nuclear weapons for deterrence? Or do you think that you still need, just like, for example, I need a belt to hold up my trousers and a braces to hold up my trousers, that you would need both deterrence, tactical nuclear weapons in Europe and missile defence in order to do the trick? I know that in your country, Germany, there's been quite a debate about this, hasn't there?
Yeah. Well, one of the hopes, of course, is that you could do with much less. I would think that even with a shield operating to a very high degree of security, of coverage, there would still be a desire and a strategic rationale for holding on to a number of nuclear arms, because in this kind of environment, you would not rely on the ability to now and for all, and for good, actually control missiles coming in, and you would want that type of armament around. But certainly it would help to come closer to Obama's vision of getting rid of most of the nuclear weapons if effectively these shields existed and were reliable to a degree that also your partners, your security partners, those enjoying a security guarantee, could be certain, or the shield would be credible enough to make them feel secure without recourse to any such weapons.
What else do you think, though, has to be done to go towards a nuclear-free world? I mean, Obama said in his speech in Prague that this was not likely to happen in his lifetime, and he presented it as a vision for the future rather than something that we can expect immediately. But if we're going to sort of move in that direction, apart from, I take your point, and I agree, sort of trying to also to have missile defense systems, but I think that you need probably a mixture of policies, right, to deal with this. One single thing, no matter how helpful, is not going to do the trick by itself. So what other things can we do, even could NATO do, to help move this vision forward? Not just as a piece of rhetoric, but in practical terms.
Well, probably you would need a much more elaborated global security framework, which would be designed in such a way that you don't need to be friends or sign an alliance agreement in order to become part of that. So it would seek to integrate in a different way than the traditional alliance a number of security interests so that you could effectively communicate to all participants in this that there is a whole range of means by which you could make certain that you, in your region, in your part of the world, in your kind of geopolitical environment, can be relatively safe. I think that's probably the essential precondition. And we'll see at the same time, and I think this is a question that goes to NATO then. NATO, in its Lisbon strategy, has said NATO will continue to be a nuclear alliance, and at the same time it subscribes to the agenda of gradually getting rid of nuclear weapons. So in a way, NATO in itself has this kind of dual statement of saying we're...
You think that seems like a bit of a contradiction, huh? At least
it sounds on the
surface.
First notice, it sounds like one. Yeah.
Well, it does on the surface, doesn't it? Until you obviously dig a little bit deeper. I think that we face two realities. The need, of course, we were talking about this, to delegitimize nuclear weapons, to rely less and less on them as we can for our security, to set the example for others, because we don't want to give them the excuse that they can develop nuclear weapons because we're building them up ourselves. So there's definitely that. But on the other hand, face the reality that, as we were saying, proliferation is likely to occur, irrational actors, you need some deterrent capability. So how do you manage the two? I think that NATO starts from the premise that the alliance has made an effort already. You remember when we came up through the Cold War, those years where, particularly in Germany, you had thousands in fact, I think it went up to 7,000 at one stage, which seems an incredible number, sort of short-range nuclear weapons deployed in Europe. Then we had, when I was coming onto the scene in the 80s, the cruise and Pershing missile deployments vis-a-vis the SS-20s on the Soviet side. And NATO, I suppose, takes the view that 90% of these weapons have now been eliminated. There's been a lot of disarmament. The United States, with the START agreement, is now coming down from 6,000, where it was at the end of the Cold War, to 1,550. That still probably strikes you as a lot. But anyway, there's been quite a big effort. The French have given up their land-based systems. The British, my compatriots, have given up one of their submarines, 4 to 3. Etc. So you could say, look, the effort can't always be on the Western side. The others have got to make an effort too. And you can't obviously have a vision of a nuclear-free world before you know that countries outside your own community are also going to join the process, right?
Which then brings me to the Russian side of it. Russia still has and holds on to a range of tactical nuclear weapons.
Very good point. Yes, indeed. In fact, I don't know the exact number. Nobody does, because the Russians haven't given a number. They haven't been, I think, to be fair, as transparent as the NATO countries.
What can NATO do in order to get a similar development going on the Russian side?
Well, I think that the great hope now is that after the new START treaty has been, as you know, ratified by both Russia and the United States, which is excellent news, that you start a new round of negotiations where you put into the mix the US owned tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, although deployed in 5 NATO countries, and the weapons on the Russian side. Can you do this? I think it's going to take time. In my own view, I don't know if you agree with me, Joseph, but in the first instance, what would be useful would be to at least have some confidence-building measures. For example, Russia would be transparent about the numbers, because in NATO, I've seen calculations that they have as many as 3,000, far more than the, I must admit, unpublicized number. So there's transparency too on the NATO side that NATO has. Secondly, that they could move those weapons away from forward deployed positions. I think it would make allies a lot more comfortable if those weapons were moved back. That you could have exchanges about the storage, the safety things. You know, build a little bit of confidence, and then later on go down on the numbers. But the question is, do you think Russia, which obviously also sees different threats of its own, and Russia, as you know, Joseph, has, as we all know, conventional forces which aren't quite in the condition that they were in the Soviet days. Do you think Russia would be interested in a kind of 0-0 option like we once had with the intermediate range weapons?
It seems they would, but you know, if I read the Russian view correctly, there's still a lot of frustration among the Russian strategic planners on the deal they got on CFE. You know, the Conventional Forces in Europe agreement, where basically, which was negotiated under the existence of the 2 military blocs, and then the one went away and NATO was expanding eastward. And basically, the Russians have been asking all along for a new arrangement reflecting current strategic realities. So I could see a situation where they would want a comprehensive package, where you see a kind of a new basic discussion on where do we stand on conventional forces in Europe, then tied to tactical. I believe still the Russians would be extremely reluctant either to go for a 0-0. They would probably argue that in their strategic view, it wasn't just the Western Front that these tactical weapons.
Well, I think this is this is the big issue, because as you well know, if you start tying everything together, the weapons that you have vis-a-vis each other, the weapons as being a potential deterrent against new kids on the block, you know, new proliferators, linking those weapons to conventional forces in Europe. I mean, if we put dollars and euros and pounds and yen all on the table, it's going to be very difficult in my mind to disaggregate that and start a negotiation, because something, you know, I don't know, the number of tanks in the Caucasus versus the number of US missile defense systems in Eastern Europe, something is going to stymie and hold up the whole lot. And I think this is going to be the issue about how we don't link everything together so that we can actually, you know, count apples against apples and pears against pears and move ahead.
One issue related to that, which has been also an issue of talk, as you know, integrating Russia or partnering with Russia on the shield, on the missile shield, has been an idea that NATO has been pondering with for quite some time. It has been offered. The Russians have said yes, they want this, but no side is really sure how it's going to work. You know, is the NATO-Russia relationship good enough to do it as a joint project?
Well, I think this is a good point that you raise, because I think this always comes up when you're talking about nuclear weapons and arms control, that you need the agreement to create confidence, but you need confidence to create the agreement. So it's a chicken and egg situation, and certainly I think it's the same with missile defense. So the good news is that the Russians are engaging on this. We're having lots of meetings. They're sending people from Moscow. They realize that this is going to be a major project, and they obviously want a system that they participate in, because that will reassure them that the US system, the phased active approach, isn't going to threaten their systems and their security. On the other hand, I have to be obviously honest, particularly with you and in this nice confidential cafe atmosphere, and say that for the time being their vision is different from our vision, because the NATO vision is very much of two systems, the Russian system, the NATO system, but somehow linked together through common data exchange, through a common sort of battle management system, common sensors, radars, but the Russian system is it's a single system, and we do it together. So frankly, we're going to have to sort of go beyond this and at least accept a broad common vision, if not of one system, at least of two interrelated systems, and then work on the details.
Maybe for the future, you know, one idea possibly could be...
Ideas are very welcome.
Is you have something like in terms of missile defense, a system of systems. Which would kind of reinforce the NATO point of view, is saying that if we think this over the longer term on a global scale, wouldn't the same reasoning that now applies to NATO's and Russia's talking about this also apply eventually to the Indians or the Chinese or some other actors in exposed regions of the world, so that in the end, part of a strategy of denying the value of nuclear weapons would be that we live in a world where you had separate but cooperable systems of missile defense that would, in a way, be driven by those actors that have the technology, but would, be autonomous or would be national in terms of giving the Chinese what they wanted or giving the Russians what they wanted, without giving them access to each other's systems, for that matter.
I think this is a very bold vision. It may even seem idealistic to some, but I think sometimes in this area where the consequences of failure are so terrible, another Hiroshima, another Nagasaki, but even worse, idealism in fact becomes realism.
Well, it could have been one of those underpinnings of a global security sort of arrangement, or flexible or multi-level security arrangement, that part of the rewards would be, if you're in it, you might have access to such a system of systems.
Well, I agree. I think two things to respond, because I think your idea is very interesting. I think the first thing is, you're right. If NATO and Russia can sort of sort this out between the two of them, and they have, the United States and Russia, 90% plus of all of the nuclear weapons in existence today, despite notwithstanding China or India or Pakistan or Israel or the other states that are talked about, 95%. So if they can sort their relationship out, particularly through cooperation, it sends a massive signal to the rest of the world. And it's a game changer for NATO and Russia as well. For the first time, I don't know your sense of history, but my sense of history would be that for the first time since the period of Napoleon, I don't really count World War II, where the alliance was not really an alliance, let's face it. It was an alliance against a common enemy rather than an alliance of strategic understanding. The fact is, it broke down very quickly after Hitler had been defeated. So I go back to the Napoleonic Wars for a time when Russia was really integrated into a European security system. And therefore, I think, yes, we should try to make that happen. But I also take your point that maybe today, in an era where not just nuclear weapons, because we haven't spoken about the other side, ballistic missiles, whether nuclear or chemical or biological, ballistic missiles are expanding faster than nuclear weapons. You've got this problem of hair trigger alert, these ballistic missiles that go very quickly, they use them or lose them scenario, the problem of miscalculation in a crisis. I think I'm being attacked, so I attack somebody else. So I think that's the big danger, and missile defense can help. And also it can deal with the other thing that we haven't spoken about, which is what happens if non-state actors, terrorist organizations, criminal groups, private militias get hold of these weapons and are even less inhibited.
I was just about to say that, because a lot of what we're talking about now has to do with delivering nuclear weapons through ballistic missiles or through other high-level military technology, which can then be detected and monitored and informed about. These non-state actors, these dirty bombs, these things you can probably carry around in a rucksack if you had it all set up right, they probably will not be affected by any type of shield that we have there. You know, it's how serious is that in terms of the NATO?
I think it's a real serious problem, because remember last time we spoke about cyber, and the conclusion we reached that this is difficult not just because of the access to technology, but it's difficult because you don't have any way of deterring these attacks. Yeah. And this is the same here. I mean, as you said, Joseph, I agree, when it comes to states, you know who they are. They can't hide the fact that they've released a missile or a weapon against you. You can retaliate against them. So deterrence, more or less, should work. But non-state actors, it won't. And therefore, I think the NATO view is that we need a totally different strategy based on prevention, stopping them being able to acquire the technologies in the first place. You saw last year that Barack Obama had this enormous meeting in Washington devoted to nuclear safety, preventing the bad guys from being able to steal or access materials, you know, fissile materials, bomb-making technology, missiles, you know, through things like making sure that they're safe. Because in many countries, look what happened since the end of the Cold War. You know, we had these fissile material hanging around laboratories with no security guards. Anybody could go in and help themselves. Or you know, AQ Khan network. Remember in Pakistan, this trading internationally in nuclear materials.
Nuclear scientists and
moving to
loose scientists in a way.
Loose nukes and loose scientists. And I know this is going to be a long-term program. But at least making sure that those countries that have nuclear materials, even for peaceful purposes, or missile technologies, you know, effectively control them, help. And I think one of the things that NATO can and should do, but sorry, to answer your question, is to try to provide advice and assistance, finance, to countries who, for example, like Ukraine, that after, or Kazakhstan, you know, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they inherited all of this material, you know, helping them to set up these effective safety systems. I mean, that's one thing that we should be doing. Because as I said, I think the only option here, even if it's not perfect either, is preventing.
You would probably obviously disagree with those people who say, well, this is much exaggerated. This is kind of NATO inventing another one risk in order to you know, to keep in the front line. But you know, it seems to follow from the fact that if the likelihood is there that the number of actors owning nuclear weapons, state actors owning nuclear weapons, will grow, could very well grow, then I believe actually we're talking about something serious here. You know, because with every new acquisition, you have new ways of not having control or actively proliferating your technology onto non-state actors.
Well, what we do know is, for example, the two countries that have been obliged to cooperate fully with the international community on weaponization, which are Iraq, because obviously the United States went in 2003, even if they didn't find weapons of mass destruction. But they also, of course, had a role in Iraq which was slightly more productive in terms of dealing with weapons of mass destruction after the first Gulf War in 1991. And then the second example is Libya, which, as you know, decided to get around sanctions. This is the old Libya I'm not talking about today with what's happening with Gaddafi. And then, you know, allowed the US and the UK to go in and inspect. And in both cases, what struck, you know, the Western inspectors was just how much stuff they had. You know, they had far more than we'd estimated. The Iraqis, for example, I remember this well, had 7 different types of reprocessing cycles. You know, so if this method with plutonium didn't work, then they would try uranium method to get the bomb. You know, Libya had enormous stocks, and so the evidence is the black market was working. They were getting around sanctions. They were suppliers, and if you're determined enough, you're going to succeed. So from that point of view, I don't think that I'm being an alarmist or a Cassandra. There is, you know, we saw with AQ Khan just how many countries were doing business with him for technologies and so on. So this is a problem. And even if sub-state actors, hopefully, God forbid, Al-Qaeda don't yet have a component, we know that they have seriously been looking at it. And we know, for example, that Hezbollah in the Lebanon has about 40,000 rockets, some of which they fire occasionally against Israel, or at least Hamas does, even if, God forbid, they don't yet have nuclear weapons.
Yeah, so this issue is going to remain with us for quite some time. Could we change a little bit, because we've got one other issue that is not strictly related to it, but is at least one of those vital interest issues for today, which is energy.
Absolutely. And how could I have forgotten? Thanks for reminding Joseph for that.
And I wonder, since we've been talking about NATO and NATO as also in its military qualities, is there a military role for NATO in energy security?
Well, what do you think? Let me put the question to you first and foremost as an analyst. Do you think this is just sort of being a bit populist by putting this topic on the agenda because sometimes it's in the headlines, as with the problem a few winters ago, you remember, between Ukraine and Russia with the gas cut-offs, and suddenly a feeling that this was a major strategic threat, or do you think you put the question to you, as I say, that NATO has really an added value here? Because I must be frank, yet again, this is something where allies, frankly, do have different opinions, even if energy security is in NATO's new strategic concept.
Well, on the one hand, if you prioritize interests, energy security is one of our vital interests. Basically, we live on the fact that we have reliable access to resources, oil and gas, and electricity for that matter, and further down the line also access to renewables at prices that we can halfway afford. So I think that's a vital interest of all the highly industrialized countries from the Western Hemisphere all the way east to China. So probably we cannot afford not to spend thought on the idea what happens, or what do we do if that flow of energy gets disrupted. And I think this has nothing to do with blood for oil type of debates that we have seen in the past. It has to do with the fact that we would run into enormous difficulties. Would there be, for political, for reasons of natural disasters, for reasons of terrorism, or other sort of disruptions, be a cut in our energy flows?
Well, Joseph, I'd like to disagree with you, but I can't, because I think that energy is a strategic issue. We use more and more of it every year. Even in recessions, the energy use grows because more and more people have computers and need electricity. More and more people own cars. I don't need to go on. And I also think that one of the problems that we have in the NATO area is that 20, 30 years ago we were producers of energy. The US produced most of its consumption out of Alaska, Texas, Pennsylvania. We in Europe had North Sea oil, UK Norway gas quite a bit. But you look at what's happened in the last 10, 20 years or so. We have become net importers. 40% of our gas comes from Russia today. I think if I saw a statistic, about 65% now of Europe's energy, even coal, although we have it ourselves, is imported because it's cheaper to buy it
cheaper from Australia or
elsewhere. And so that's one worry. I mean, you have to worry about your dependence on things you don't control, even if most of the time the market functions. But I think the second strategic aspect for the NATO countries is that most of the stuff is now state-owned. I mean, when I was a young boy, many years ago, the Western oil companies, the big majors, sort of owned most of the oil. That's finished. Only 4%, I understand now, is in the hands of the sort of Western oil companies. 80% nationalised, state-owned, and sometimes that's in countries which are friendly. Sometimes, well, if not unfriendly, at least countries which are unstable and unpredictable.
So you're arguing implicitly that because state owns energy resources and states probably are likely to react to the fact that there is a military alliance around the corner, that makes them more cooperative? Or is that the military role of NATO in energy security?
Well, no, it's certainly not to suggest that we're militarizing the subject. I agree, you've picked me up there, and I think I admit that you've got a good point. I think that would be counterproductive to suggest that military forces would be sort of sent to secure energy supplies outside conflict situations. And certainly, you remember in the Middle East, wrongly, but nonetheless, all of those views in 2003 that the US was only going there to take possession of Iraq's oil, which is, of course, wrong, but still. Yeah. So, no, I don't think we want to convey that any perception. But I do think that, given the centrality of energy, it's something that the Allies should consult about. Yeah. Not just say we leave it to the market, even if the market's important, but that it should be on the agenda. We should monitor trends. We should, because the situation could change. Sometimes the situation could change for the better quickly. Yeah. Oil price goes down, although that's because of the recession, but still, or the US discovers shale gas and therefore there are more supplies. But as we see, with the Japanese nuclear disaster and turmoil in the Middle East or Libya, sometimes it can quickly go the other way with the oil price going up $50. So for that reason, I think that even if NATO is not a leading actor on energy security, it's at least something that we should keep an eye on, given its strategic importance.
Well, the obvious point that I could see is you've alluded to the fact more and more energy has been transported. The pipeline business, Russia to Western Europe, I think is probably one of the least problematic in that sense. But everything that has to go on sea has a potential for disruption. And actually, when we look at where now does the military have a role in energy security, it is fighting piracy.
I agree.
And it's protecting
the critical infrastructure.
The critical infrastructure, the routes of transportation. I think probably that's an evident case. And probably that's also a case where, over the medium term, this is one of those partnership arguments, because a lot of the other actors now, not part of the alliance, but heavily consuming natural resources and notably energy, should have a similar interest.
And in some cases producing the energy as well. In the case of Qatar, where I was recently, which of course has the second largest reserves of gas. I agree. I think that it's in this area that you can have a military role, but it's best done, absolutely, not by NATO itself as with piracy, but in cooperation with others. But Joseph, the one thing about children's theatres is they close early. And we have to stop for today, because they're going to graciously escort us to the exit in a few moments. But I'd like again to thank you once again for the conversation, as always, and look forward to our next one.
Not exactly a kids' topic, but
no, they never are. But at least meeting in kids' theatres creates the right atmosphere. But thanks again for today.
You're welcome.
Could NATO have, for example, achieved a better relationship with Russia if it had acted differently at the end of the Cold War?
Despite of the debates that we had a couple of years ago, Russia as an ordinary country, that is not the way that the Russian leadership sees Russia.
The cooperation with Russia at the global level seems to be working better than the cooperation with Russia in the European neighborhood.
Russia is rather with Europe than sees itself as a part in Europe.
Often NATO and Russia have come at it like people looking through a telescope from opposite ends.
You could see Russia as being part of such an alliance, but it would be very much a different alliance than it is today.
Do you think we have the ability significantly to influence the way Russia will go in future?